At 4:17 p.m. on the afternoon of July 20, 1969, the hatch of the lunar module Eagle opened. Millions of people worldwide watched as astronaut Neil Armstrong descended a ladder attached to the spaceship and then became the first man ever to set foot on the surface of the moon. That occasion was punctuated by Armstrong's famous statement,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
"It is unlikely that any of us will ever set foot on the moon. Yet every day we take steps that may be of even greater significance. While they are typically small steps, they have in them the potential to change the trajectory of our lives, our future, and our faith. Small steps that may be in fact giant leaps."
Well, there's a day about 2,000 years ago on this little bitty speck of a planet out there somewhere in space, but this place that we call home. 2,000 years ago, there were 10 men who were walking down a path that day outside of town, on the outskirts. Not because they wanted to necessarily, but because they had to. You see, they weren't welcome inside the village. They were the cast-offs. They were the marginalized. They were the deplorables and the undesirables of the day. They were lepers. They had a horrible and a contagious disease. So to protect everybody from them, they faced an indefinite quarantine. But little did they know that that same day that they were walking on a trail outside of town, somebody else would walk on that same trail outside of that same town, and I think on purpose. His name was Jesus, and maybe they had heard of him before. It's possible. He had walked through different villages, and he had healed different people and cured the blind and given ears to those who were deaf and helped those who were lame to stand up and walk again. And maybe they'd heard those stories, and maybe they realized as they looked off in the distance who this was that was coming towards them. Because if they did, it was their opportunity. It was their chance. And so as they came from one direction and Jesus came from another direction, they stopped. Probably both of them, because that distance had to be maintained. And they stood over here and they said, "What? Jesus, have mercy on us. Jesus, have mercy on us." They didn't ask for justice. They didn't ask for validation. They didn't even ask for healing. They simply asked for mercy, and that's what they received. Now, their story is told in Luke chapter 17, and I want to encourage you to turn there with me and read with me there this morning. For this past several weeks, we have been talking about this idea of taking faith steps, small steps that often turn into giant leaps. But they're decisions that we make, they are actions that we take that move us forward in our faith stories. And oftentimes, they don't seem to be super significant, but they have significant impact on our story. And in this story, we see 10 men who actually take small steps, but those small steps become very impactful. That is a lot. Okay, are we there? Down, down, down. All right. And those small steps become impactful in their story. But there's another guy in this story who takes a small step, and his small step actually becomes a giant leap. We don't know his name. We do know that he was a leper. We don't know how long he had been sick, but we find out some important things about him and from him that can help us as we face the need to take a faith step in our lives. And this faith step that I want to talk about here this morning, I believe has incredible potential to actually transform our lives. Seriously. Now, I realize we go to church a lot of times. It's like, well, we hear all these impactful things, and every one of them is supposed to change our lives. This step right here actually has that real potential to change our lives. And the crazy thing is, it's a small step that we all can take. So as we dive into the story, it's told only in the Gospel of Luke. It's a medical story, which is fitting. Luke is a doctor who's also an author. But Luke tells us something important here about Jesus, the fact that he cares about humanity. We find out about the humility of Jesus as he reaches into the story of an undesirable. It tells us about his willingness to include the outsider and the marginalized. I think it's also interesting to note here that Luke was a Greek, not a Jew, and one of the men who's healed in this story was not a Jew either. But here's what he says in Luke chapter 17, verse number 11. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee, and as he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance, that's probably at least 6 feet apart, right? They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." Now, I'm a firm believer that Jesus was very intentional about the way that he lived his life. So the things that he said were on purpose. The places that he went were on purpose. Even the paths that he took to get there, I believe, were on purpose. So I believe in this story that Jesus is actually planning to meet these guys on the way. But note this. Jesus is attracted to their need. We have it in our minds sometimes that in our state and our sinfulness or whatever, that we're too ugly, that God would never be interested in us, and we got to get ourselves somehow cleaned up so that we're okay. And the truth of the matter is, in this story, is that the ugliness of their disease is what attracted Jesus. And I think we need to be reminded that we don't need to be good enough for God. We just need to be needy enough for God. And so they were needy and they begged for mercy. And what does Jesus say to them? He says, when he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were cleansed. They weren't cleansed standing there. They were cleansed as they went. They were cleansed as they took these small steps of faith, small steps of obedience. And on their way, they experienced the giant leap of healing. And faith typically requires us to take steps. Now, these men were supposed to go show themselves to the priest. And what was the idea behind that? Well, it went back to an Old Testament law that required anybody who had an infectious or serious skin disease, leprosy would certainly qualify, that they had to be quarantined and had to go outside of the town because it was too dangerous for everybody else to be around them. And so they were forever cut off from civilization, from society, because of this illness. And if by some strange or rare chance that they experienced healing, somebody had to say, well, they can be allowed back into society. And so that was the role of the priest. And so Jesus is just telling them to do what the Old Testament scriptures told them to do. Well, we can relate to where these guys were, even as we deal with this pandemic. Because what these guys were experiencing was isolation. It was not just a disease, it was the fact that they were cut off, that they were on the other side of the wall, so it were. And I think we have had to deal with that in our own situation here. So much isolation. It's like we see people, but we see them from a distance, and there's people that are part of our story, but they're somewhere over there, and we're just left with FaceTiming them. And so we feel this sense that these guys would have felt back in this day where they were banished from home, from family, from their communities, to live in isolation indefinitely. And so when we look at this story, we need to remember that it's more than just about being healed from leprosy. It was about having their lives and having their relationships restored. But the only way that could happen was for the priest to say, okay, you guys are good now. You can join us again in society. And so these 10 men are healed, and it's a great story, but the story doesn't just stop with their healing. It goes on, and it gets even better, but it just involves one of them from this point on. In verse number 15, one of them, when he saw he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. And there's a lot of loud talking in the story as you read it. But notice what he does next. This man who has been isolated, who has been separated, he comes and he throws himself at Jesus' feet. Right here, this close, for the first time in a long time. And he thanked him, and then it throws in that little phrase there, and he was a Samaritan. So he took actually, though, an extra step of faith. Because 10 men had been healed, 10 men went to the priest had declared them clean, and one of them turns and takes faith steps back to Jesus. And Jesus says to him, were there not 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner? And it reminds us a lot of today, doesn't it? Where we have so much and we enjoy so much privilege and opportunity and blessings, and we go on our way never giving thanks, and our society goes on its way never giving thanks. In fact, we do just the opposite. We complain, and we whine, and we get stingy and selfish and small, and we think that we're entitled, and we demand our rights on this, and we have to have this, and we struggle with discontentment and with self-pity and all of these things, and we're continuously angry and bitter. And why are we all of those things? Because we're ungrateful. But why in the world are we so ungrateful when we have so much? Jesus says to him, and I love this, Jesus says to him, "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." Now, this is an important part of the story. He's not talking now about being healed from leprosy. Earlier he said, "Go show yourself to the priest." He had gone, and we assume showed himself to the priest, and he had been healed from his leprosy earlier. Now he comes back, and as he comes back, Jesus is talking about that faith of coming back, that faith of expressing gratitude. And he says, "Oh, by the way, you've been made," if it's King James Version, "you've been made whole," or New International Version, "you have been made well." This guy, this 1 in 10, experienced something different than the other 9 did because of his willingness to come back in faith. And by expressing that gratitude, his world was opened up in a different way, and his small step became a huge, giant leap. Well, I want to encourage all of us today to express gratitude, to live a grateful life. But not just living a grateful life isn't just about saying thank you. It's about actually living gratefully in your story. So let me just point out 5 truths that we can gain from this story here today. The first one is this. By giving thanks, we are forced to adopt a posture of humility. By giving thanks, we are forced to adopt a posture of humility. It's when I realize that what I have, what I've experienced, whatever I can claim, has been given to me because of the contributions of people around me. And so I become less impressed with who I am and with what I've accomplished, and I realize that there have been people in my story who have made a huge difference in my life. Maybe it's the teacher who saw something in me when I was just a kid. Maybe it was a friend who, when I was at my low, was the one who bent down and picked me up and got me going again. Maybe it was the parent who financed a lot of your life in your education. Maybe it was a boss who saw something. But all of us can think through those times in our stories where somebody stepped into our story, and what they gave to us was what we needed because we didn't have what we needed within ourselves. And so we are forced back to that place of humility where we realize we couldn't have done it without them. Now, gratitude has 2 parts, they tell us. The first one is this. It's the acknowledgement of good in our lives. So if I'm a grateful person, I acknowledge the good in my life. But the second part is that I recognize where that good came from because it came from outside somewhere. And so this idea of gratitude pushes us to be less about ourselves and to be less self-centered, self-absorbed, self-reliant, and to be more about the gifts and blessings that other people have put into our lives. And so it pushes us into humility. Secondly, by giving thanks, we can experience wholeness and wellness. We can experience wholeness and wellness. Now, I don't want to say what this passage isn't saying, but when this man came back, Jesus said to him what? He said, "Your faith has made you whole." But what did this man do? He had expressed praise and he expressed thanks. So the only visible or even verbal expression of faith that this man had made was what? Gratitude. And so Jesus is saying, you have showed faith by expressing this gratitude, but in this expression of your gratitude, you have actually, you've been made whole or you've been made well. And let me at least suggest something here to think about this morning. And that's this, that when we learn to give thanks and when we learn to live gratefully, we invite wholeness and wellness into our lives. Certainly spiritually. because we realize who God is and the difference that he's made in our story. But we invite that wholeness and wellness into our lives as people, emotionally and mentally, physically, spiritually, because we're interconnected people. They tell us, and mental health experts has been saying this for a long time, the potential that gratitude has to change and to rewire our brains and our emotions. And when we're struggling with things like anxiety or depression or some of these ills that we have emotionally and mentally, that one of the best things that we can do is to learn to express gratitude. It reduces stress and anxiety. It produces peace and calmness. We have greater levels of emotions like joy, enthusiasm, love, happiness, and optimism. It also protects us against deadly emotions like greed, envy, bitterness, and resentment. Gratitude breaks these negative mental and emotional patterns. It's hard to feel sorry for yourself and be grateful for what you have at the same time. It forces us to realize how good we have, and it also reminds us, when we get to gratitude, of all the people that we have in our stories who've contributed to us. But that means that we're loved and we're appreciated, even sometimes when we feel like we're not. Now, when they came out last Sunday and said, okay, we're going to be locking down a little bit here again, I realized what that meant to me was, oh no, the library is going to be back to curbside service. And I love to go to the library and get books, but it's really hard to pick out books from the curb, if you've noticed that. You have to call ahead and ask for what you want. And so I was like, I am running over there before they shut this thing down. So Tuesday night, I ran into the library last thing before they shut and went back to curbside. And I was looking around, and I found this book, and I think I just left it sitting there on the floor. So can you throw that book up to me? I'm always checking out what the new books were coming to the library, and see that one says new. And it was called The Thank You Project. And I realized what we were talking about on Sunday. I'm like, oh, I wonder what this book is about. It's written by a woman by the name of Nancy Davis Coe. I have no idea who she is. But when she turned 50 years old, she decided that she would go back and identify 50 people in her life that had made a difference. And once per week for 50 weeks, for her 50th year of life, she would write a letter and send it to that person. And so this is the story, a little bit of what she had done, and then also on how you could do the same thing. But it's this idea of how we can benefit ourselves even by giving thanks. In her introduction to this book, she quotes a counselor by the name of Carolyn Carter who says this: if you could sell gratitude as a pill, you would be rich. Think about that one. All the things that we invest in medicine-wise to help us feel better, this counselor says if we could put that idea of gratitude into a pill and everybody could take it, they would be lining up to buy this pill. Fascinating, isn't it? Well, here's the third thought here this morning. By giving thanks, we are able to bless those who have blessed us. Do you have somebody in your life who's given you some joy? You can return joy to them simply by saying thank you. And what a great gift that is. This book is interesting to me, and it starts out with her introduction. She's sitting at the desk of her father. She's gone back home to visit. She's sitting in his office. She's sitting at his desk, and she looks up and realizes that the letter that she wrote to him is one of those 50 people. He took it, appreciated it so much that he took and had it framed, and it was in that letter. And she actually, in the book, lays out and reads us through that letter. And she gets to the end of reading through that letter, and she said, and then I opened up my laptop, and I typed eulogy. She was back for her father's funeral. But she sat in the office that day and realized the difference that a letter had made. But when we give thanks, we are able to bless those who have blessed us. And in this story, in a sense, this man comes back and blesses Jesus because of the gift that Jesus has given him. And when we do that, we value people. And it's a way of saying, hey, you matter to me. You've made a difference in my life. There's another idea that comes out of this. By giving thanks, we can adjust our perspective. Giving thanks reduces the size of my problems, and we all have problems. And as you come in here this morning, we're all struggling. but it reduces the size of my problems when I compare them to the size of my God. As we talked about earlier, we have a God who can hold the galaxies in his hand. How big is your problem? Not very. And by giving thanks, it allows me to adjust my perspective. And God tells us to give praise and to give thanks. And it's not because he needs it. It's not that he needs some little person on some little speck of some little earth and some little solar system to say, thank you so much. You know, I'm just a little guy. But it's when I start to say thank you that I look up and I'm like, oh, wow. What a God. What a God. And it adjusts my perspective, and it gets me out of my funk, and it gets me into the glory of my life that God has given to me. And it adjusts our perspective. I love that little phrase in there, and he was a Samaritan. That was saying, like, not only is he a leper, he was lower than a leper. He was a Samaritan leper. And Jesus came and said, I can help you. And it changes our perspective to know how much even we matter to God. Lastly, by giving thanks, we can take giant leaps of faith. And mastering this idea can change your life. Paul said what? Give thanks in everything in 1 Thessalonians. And we need to be grateful at all times, and we can focus on the good and the blessings. We can even be thankful for some of the hard times in life because it gives God opportunity to do big things in our stories. But I want to take this as just a step further and not just feel thankful or be thankful. I think we need to express our thanksgiving in our gratitude. And that's when it becomes transformative to us in our lives. See, I'm not questioning whether or not we have leprosy or have problems, whatever our leprous problem is. The question this morning is, do we have gratitude? And if we express that gratitude, because gratitude that's unexpressed is ingratitude. And so we need to give thanks as a spiritual expression. It's a spiritual matter. It's a spiritual act of worship. And that's what we've been doing this morning. We've been stopping to say, thank you, God. We've been stopping to say, what a great God, and to open up our eyes and our hearts to the size of this God and what he has done for us. Psalm 8, what is man? We saw the video that you created him. When I look at all of these heavens. Earlier I said that there are two parts to gratitude: recognizing the good in our lives, realizing that it comes from without. There is actually a third part of gratitude, and it's simply this: expressing gratitude. Expressing gratitude. So I want to encourage us to do three things here this morning. Small steps. The first one is this. I want to challenge you with this idea to write a letter or 2 or 3 or 50 of gratitude. Just start with one this week, but get that letter written, and then aim for the next one the next week, and aim for the next one the next week. But will you write a letter of gratitude? Secondly, maybe you could take that letter and actually address it to Jesus for what he's done in your life. But to actually physically sit down with pen and paper, or you're better on a laptop or computer, whatever, do it that way. But to actually write a letter of gratitude. That's the challenge. And then thirdly, to make gratitude a way of life where you go through life, and instead of finding things to complain about and feel bad about and feel sorry for yourself about, to go through life and to recognize all the great things that you're enjoying and to realize what the source is, or literally who the source is. Let's be like that. So as we do that this morning, and we're going to celebrate communion here in just a second. So invite the worship team to come back up. But as we do that, I want us to just stop and think about this guy and to put yourself in his shoes as he stood outside of town there. And to think about his story, how it was changed. He was no longer sick. He was no longer isolated. He was no longer despised by the world around him. He was no longer hopeless. He was no longer insignificant. He was no longer plagued by the emotional baggage of what he had been through. All of those things were gone, and I wanted to ask you this question. What has Jesus taken away from you? How has he blessed you? How has he put good things into your story? How has this God so big reached down into the story of somebody so small to say, hey, you matter to me? So as we move to communion this morning, it's a time of reflection. And what we're going to do, you have that. Hopefully you picked that up on the way in. If you didn't, you can sneak out there real quick and grab one at the back. But the worship team's going to lead us in a song this morning. Take some time in the song to reflect and to express your gratitude. Because gratitude unexpressed is ingratitude. But express your gratitude to God for what he's done. At the end of the song, we'll all celebrate communion together. And then we'll finish with one last song of praise and thanksgiving.